Today we're going to be discussing different types of data that we can use when running research studies in social science research. We're going to talk about three different types of data: primary, secondary, and administrative data, understand the advantages and disadvantages, and discuss whether or not a project should use primary data, secondary data, or if we should get it from administrative agencies or official records from agencies. Now, what is primary data? Well, as that phrase implies, it's data that's collected firsthand for a specific research project. So that means me as a researcher, if I come up with a great research question, I can go out into the field and collect my own data for that specific project. I would call that primary data collection. Now, we can use either qualitative data, those narratives we spoke about, interviews, ethnographies, observations, or we can use more traditional quantitative type data, surveys, risk assessments, looking at numbers, and that would be included in our primary data collection. It can come in all sorts of forms. So we don't just need to consider numbers as data, we can use all sorts of different sources. Newspapers, analyzing speeches, even looking at maps. So what is secondary data? If primary data is data collected by the researcher for a specific project, secondary means we're probably the people using it second. So it's taking existing data that someone else has collected as part of a project or an ongoing research that they're conducting, and it's gathered by someone else for their research purposes, but again, using it in my project. So I'm taking data that's been collected and I'm reusing it for a new purpose. So I can come up with a research question and say, wow, I wonder what type of data I would need to answer that. And someone might have a great data set out there that I could analyze. Again, secondary data can take two forms as well, quantitative or qualitative. It can come from all different sources. We can even use journal publications as a source of secondary data. All of these that you see on the screen here are examples of secondary data. It doesn't differ too much from primary data. The big reason is, where did it come from? Did we collect it ourselves for the purpose of this study, or was it collected by someone else? If it was collected by someone else, then we know it's secondary data. Now, what is administrative data? Now, that's not data collected by researchers at all. This is collected by administrative agencies like the government, policing agencies, the Australian Tax Office, the FBI. So imagine an agency or an organization out there exists and they keep their own files and their own records. If we as researchers ask to use their data, then we would consider that administrative data. We can call it several different things. We can call it organizational data, institutional data, administrative data, official sources of data. It all means the same thing. Other agencies have collected it as part of their jobs. Again, it can be quantitative or qualitative. Most times we would find a lot of quantitative data here. If we're thinking about arrest rates, crime rates, police records, things analyzed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, those are very likely to be quantitative in nature. Qualitative, we might be looking at things like medical reports where we can go through and read an entire case and pick out exactly what we need. Again, can come from all sorts of different sources: educational records, health records, policing, court records, or the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now, what are some of the advantages of using research that was not, or using data that was collected for a purpose, not a specific purpose of my own research study? Well, look, it all boils down to time and effort. Someone else has gone out and collected the data, and now I have it to be able to analyze and hopefully answer a research question that I have. By using a big research team, you can gather lots and lots of data, have a very large sample size, whereas me as a single or solo researcher, I might not be able to ever collect that much data to answer my own research question. So therefore, I can create more evidence and more literature based on a large data set than I could if I did everything all by myself. In some cases, it can be very cheap or even free to access. There are entire consortiums of data. We'll talk about one in America that students and all sorts of scientists can go in and access hundreds of thousands of different records and be able to answer research questions if they can fit them in. Now, we don't usually have to get ethics approval if we're using secondary data. We're assuming that the other researcher, the person who did the primary research, has gotten data collection, and therefore we're not putting anybody else at risk by just using that data for our own question. Now, some of the disadvantages include these you see on the screen. Well, data could have been collected 10, 20, 30 years ago, and it could be a bit outdated. If we think about if we're using data from the national census, we only do a census every 5. In America, we do a census every 10 years. So information from a census could possibly be up to 10 years old when you're analyzing it. It wouldn't be as accurate as if you had data collected from today. Now, there could have been issues with internal validity. Because we're relying on other people's interpretations, their conceptualization and operationalization of variables, we might not have 100% certainty that those measures are really accurately measuring what we want them to. Now, when data is not gathered for the specific research purpose that we have in mind, it could be completely irrelevant. We might think it could have a good answer to our research question, but you might have to do several iterations and come up with a research question the data can actually address. In some cases, it could be very costly, or it could be very time consuming. Waiting for an agency to give you a data set, or they might place some limitations where you can only access the data at their offices on a secure server. So it's not as easy as just downloading it, sticking it on a USB drive and coming home and running your own stats. And obviously it's less flexible than primary data collection, because when we as the researcher go into the field and collect our own data, we can notice, oh, this isn't exactly what I'm getting at. So I might change my data collection technique. I might change my research question slightly, but we're not able to do this when we're using somebody else's data. Now, collecting our own data, obviously lots of advantages here. It is tailored to our own research aims and objectives, and I can determine exactly what data will be collected and how it will be used. I can ensure how complete that data will be, whereas if I rely on a police agency, they might miss things and don't care as much as I as a researcher would. Data interpretation for primary data is always a bit better because you have in mind as the researcher exactly what you need to analyze and where you want to go and the questions you want answered by that data. But it is time consuming. It's relying on participants' subjectivity and availability. If we're asking people to recall things from their past, they could have a lot of memory loss or incorrect memories of things that happened in their childhoods, and that could really affect the data that we get. Obviously, if we as the researcher have something in mind, we could have researcher bias present. And we also need to consider the reliability of raters. Remember a couple of weeks ago when we talked about reliability, especially when it comes to other people recording data. If you've got more than one person recording data, we need to make sure those people are doing it very similarly, and what we call that inter-rater reliability. Administrative data, on the other hand, organizations like the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Tax Office, the National Census, these have ongoing monitoring of entire populations. However, these things are very large. So in some ways that is really, really good because we've got a really big data set to work with, but sometimes can be very overwhelming. It can provide data at multiple levels. I can look nationally, I can look at the state level, or even by the city. So we can consider, well, what unit of analysis do we want to include in our study? And do I need this much data or this much? So having a large data set from an administrative agency, I could really use to my advantage. There is no burden to participants. There shouldn't be a whole lot of ethics or ethical issues that arise because these administration or these agencies are collecting it as part of their ongoing duties. Police keep records of people that are arrested and released. However, we as researchers, we could make sure to de-identify this and make sure that we're not irresponsibly using that data. Disadvantages would be these. It might not be the population of interest. You might look at QPS data, and that's all data for people who have been arrested. However, we as researchers might want to know about people who are serial offenders in the community who have not been arrested. That data set would be completely useless in a research question if we're looking at people who have not been arrested. Measurement and validity problems definitely can exist in both secondary and administrative sources of data because we as the researcher don't have control over the study. When someone else is collecting that data and putting information, compiling it into a data set, they do it for their own purposes. We need to be very careful and mindful of these things as researchers when we're using someone else's information. It could contain errors. I think that's a well-known fact. If you're using someone else's, especially administration or an institution's data, the way they record things might not be the same way that we record things. However, this is the advantages and pitfalls of using data that's collected by other people. It can be very time efficient and it can save you a lot of work. Instead of going in the field and collecting it yourself, putting someone else's data to use can be very good.